They did not merely enter the war, they reshaped it. When the United States finally committed its full weight to the global conflict, it did so with a certainty forged not in desperation, but in confidence. This was a nation that understood something fundamental about modern warfare. That victory no longer belonged to the swiftest blade or the bravest charge, but to those who could harness industry, intelligence, and engineering into a single unstoppable force. Across the American landscape, factories awakened like engines of destiny. Steel flowed endlessly, machines roared without pause, and the skies themselves would soon carry the signature of a civilization that had learned how to turn effort into dominance. What emerged from this moment was not just a weapon, but a manifestation of national will, a declaration that American ingenuity, when fully unleashed, could bend the course of history. Out of that immense industrial surge rose an aircraft that embodied excess with purpose and power with intent. It was not born to be admired for elegance or praised for finesse. It was built to endure where others failed, to survive where others fell, and to impose presence through sheer inevitability. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt entered the sky like a monument in motion. Vast and uncompromising, carrying within its structure the philosophy of a nation that refused to accept limits imposed by tradition or convention. Every inch of its design spoke of abundance, of strength multiplied by scale, of engineering unconcerned with subtlety and obsessed with results. At its core thundered a machine that could only have been conceived in an industrial society operating at full capacity. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine was not simply powerful. It was overwhelming. 18 cylinders working in relentless harmony, producing force not for brief moments of brilliance, but for sustained dominance. This engine did not whisper through the air. It announced itself. It shook the sky. And paired with a sophisticated turbo supercharger system, it allowed the Thunderbolt to thrive where the air thinned and enemies weakened. At high altitude, where bombers carried the weight of strategic war, the P-47 stood guard, strong and unyielding, turning the upper reaches of the sky into territory controlled by American engineering. This mattered more than anyone initially realized. The air war over Europe had been brutal and costly, defined by long-range missions that pushed bomber crews beyond protection. For too long, American bombers flew exposed, their escorts forced to turn back before the most dangerous stretches of their journeys. Losses mounted, confidence was tested, and the limits of earlier designs became painfully clear. The Thunderbolt changed that equation not through grace, but through endurance. It stayed. It climbed. It fought where protection was needed most. And it did so again and again, reshaping expectations on both sides of the conflict. When the Thunderbolt fired, it did not negotiate. 8.50 caliber machine guns unleashed a volume of fire that transformed moments into devastation. Enemy aircraft were torn apart, ground targets erased, and entire corridors of movement rendered unsafe. Bombs and rockets expanded its role beyond escort, turning it into a weapon capable of striking the arteries of war itself. Railways, convoys, supply depots, armored columns, all fell under its shadow. This was not precision for its own sake. This was power applied deliberately, backed by a logistical system capable of sustaining it without pause. Yet the true revelation of the Thunderbolt lay not in what it destroyed, but in what it survived. Time after time, aircraft returned from missions bearing wounds that defied belief. Wings shredded by flak, fuselages pierced by cannon fire, cockpits filled with oil and smoke, control systems compromised beyond reason, and still they flew. Pilots emerged alive from machines that looked as though they had already surrendered to gravity. This was not chance, it was design. Armor protected the pilot. Redundant systems absorbed failure. Fuel tanks sealed themselves against fire. The aircraft had been built with the assumption that damage was inevitable and survival mandatory. For those who flew it, the Thunderbolt inspired a rare and powerful confidence. It allowed pilots to press attacks longer, to stay with bombers deeper into hostile airspace, to dive hard against ground targets and pull away under crushing forces. They trusted the machine not because it promised safety, but because it had proven itself indifferent to punishment. For those who faced it, the experience was something else entirely. Familiar tactics failed. Hits that should have guaranteed kills produced nothing but smoke and escape. The Thunderbolt did not behave like an aircraft that understood fear. It behaved like a system designed to continue regardless of circumstance. This realization crept in slowly at first, then all at once. Enemy pilots began to question what they were seeing. Machines that refused to fall, engines that continued to roar after being struck, aircraft that escaped dives at speeds few could follow. Combat ceased to feel like a contest of skill and became instead a confrontation with industrial inevitability. To fight the Thunderbolt was to fight not just a pilot, but a civilization that could replace losses, repair damage, and return the next day with undiminished force. The Thunderbolt was never meant to be rare or precious. It was meant to be present. Produced in staggering numbers, repaired and returned to service repeatedly. It represented the logic of American war production, translated directly into combat power. This was the deeper message carried into the sky, that the United States did not rely on miracles or singular moments of heroism alone. It relied on systems designed to endure longer than any enemy could sustain resistance. And in that endurance lay the true source of superiority. Not arrogance, not spectacle, but the quiet certainty that when technology, strategy, and industrial capacity align, the outcome becomes a matter of time. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not simply an aircraft of the Second World War. It was proof that modern war had entered a new era. One where power was measured not only by what could be destroyed, but by what could continue. And for those who witnessed it carving through the sky, scarred yet unstoppable, the message was unmistakable. This was what American strength looked like when fully realized. As the Thunderbolt became a constant presence over Europe, the war in the air began to change in ways that statistics alone could not fully capture. The skies grew more crowded with American aircraft that did not arrive hesitantly or withdraw early, but pressed forward with a confidence born of preparation and scale. Missions no longer felt like isolated efforts. They felt coordinated, sustained, and relentless. For bomber crews, the sight of the massive P-47s holding formation nearby brought something rare in wartime aviation: reassurance. These were not escorts that would vanish when fuel gauges dipped or engines strained. These were machines designed to stay, to fight, and to absorb what the enemy could deliver. The Thunderbolt's size, once mocked, now became a psychological weapon in itself. Enemy pilots approaching from a distance could not mistake it for anything else. Its broad wings, thick fuselage, and unmistakable engine note announced a presence that felt immovable. This was not an opponent to be brushed aside quickly. It demanded attention, effort, and risk. And even then, the outcome was uncertain. Engagements that should have ended decisively stretched longer, draining energy, ammunition, and confidence. The Thunderbolt did not merely contest the airspace. It occupied it. As encounters multiplied, patterns emerged that unsettled those accustomed to predictability. German pilots reported firing sustained bursts into thunderbolts, only to watch them dive away at terrifying speed, trailing smoke but refusing to disintegrate. Anti-aircraft gunners watched shells detonate against aircraft that continued forward instead of breaking apart. Each survival added weight to a growing realization that this was not an adversary governed by familiar limits. The Thunderbolt seemed less like a fragile instrument of flight and more like a moving fortress, indifferent to punishment and focused solely on completing its task. That indifference to damage was not arrogance. It was calculation. The aircraft had been designed from the outset to accept harm as a condition of existence. Its radial engine could lose cylinders and still deliver power. Its structure distributed stress in ways that prevented sudden catastrophic failure. Its systems were arranged so that no single hit could easily end the fight. Even when control surfaces were compromised, the Thunderbolt often retained enough authority to remain flyable. This meant that combat did not end the moment something went wrong. It extended, lingered, and gave pilots time to escape, time to maneuver, time to live. In that time, something else happened. Pilots began to push boundaries. They dove faster, struck harder, and stayed longer over targets that mattered. Ground attacks grew more aggressive as Thunderbolts descended on rail yards, bridges, convoys, and fortified positions with overwhelming force. The aircraft's weight, once criticized, now became an advantage, allowing it to maintain stability in steep dives and recover from brutal pullouts. Machine gun fire stitched the ground. Bombs shattered infrastructure. Rockets tore through armored columns. The Thunderbolt was no longer just guarding the war from above. It was reaching down and reshaping it. This expansion of role further reinforced the aircraft's identity. It was not confined to a single mission or philosophy. It adapted without losing its core strength. Escort fighter, interceptor, ground attacker, it fulfilled each role with the same underlying principle: endure, strike, return. That consistency mattered. It simplified planning, training, and execution. It allowed commanders to rely on a platform that could be tasked flexibly without fear that it would collapse under unexpected demands. In a war defined by uncertainty, reliability became a form of dominance. For the enemy, this reliability translated into exhaustion. Every engagement carried the risk of expending precious resources for uncertain results. Ammunition ran dry. Fuel was consumed. Pilots returned with fewer confirmed victories and more unanswered questions. Why did these aircraft keep coming back? Why did damage no longer guarantee success? Why did the sky feel increasingly hostile? These questions gnawed at confidence, and confidence is as critical in war as fuel or firepower. The Thunderbolt did not need to win every engagement outright. It needed only to erode certainty, to make every attack feel costly and incomplete. Behind every Thunderbolt in the air stood an immense system on the ground. Factories continued to produce replacements and upgrades. Mechanics worked tirelessly to repair damage and return aircraft to service. Supply chains ensured that fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowed without interruption. Pilots rotated through training and combat in an organized rhythm designed to sustain pressure indefinitely. This was not chaos. It was orchestration. The Thunderbolt was simply the most visible expression of that orchestration, the point where industrial effort met the enemy directly. As weeks turned into months, the air war took on a new character. American formations grew more confident, more aggressive, and more persistent. Losses still occurred, but they no longer dictated strategy. The system absorbed them and moved forward. The thunderbolt symbolized this shift. It did not promise safety or ease, it promised continuity. And continuity, applied at scale, became decisive. There were moments, however, when this broader truth condensed into a single, unforgettable image. Moments when one aircraft, one pilot, and one engagement captured everything the thunderbolt represented. High above occupied Europe, in a sky filled with violence and chaos, such a moment would arrive. An aircraft isolated, overwhelmed, and torn apart would continue flying when nothing about the situation suggested it should. And in that moment, the gap between expectation and reality would become impossible to ignore, not only for the man inside the cockpit, but for the enemy watching it unfold. What followed would not merely test metal and machinery. It would force a reckoning with a new kind of warfare, one where courage and skill collided with industrial certainty. The Thunderbolt had already proven that it could survive. Now it would demonstrate something even more unsettling, that survival itself could become a weapon. High above occupied Europe, on a day that would later seem almost unreal to those who studied it, the sky became the stage for a moment that condensed everything the Thunderbolt represented into a single confrontation. The air was crowded with tension, filled with the distant echoes of engines and the invisible lines of strategy that guided formations across hostile territory. In the midst of this vast machinery of war, one American pilot found himself isolated, separated from the protective geometry of his formation, surrounded by danger in its purest form. It was the kind of situation that usually ended quickly, decisively, and tragically. Yet what unfolded instead would redefine what survival meant in modern aerial combat. As enemy fighters descended, their approach precise and practiced, the engagement exploded into violence. Cannon fire tore through the air, striking metal with brutal force. The Thunderbolt shuddered under the impact as shells ripped into its structure, tearing through wings, fuselage, and systems designed to keep it alive. Oil flooded the cockpit, smoke clouded vision, and the scent of burning metal filled the confined space around the pilot. Fire flashed briefly, a reminder of how close destruction truly was. By every known rule of flight, by every expectation formed through years of combat, this should have been the end. Aircraft did not survive this. Pilots did not escape this. The sky claimed them. But the Thunderbolt refused to obey expectation. Damaged beyond recognition, stripped of the illusion of perfection, it continued to fly. Controls responded when they should not have. The engine continued to produce power when logic suggested silence. The aircraft steadied itself against gravity and chaos, held together not by chance, but by decisions made years earlier in factories far from the battlefield. In that moment, the distance between industrial planning and human survival collapsed into a single reality. What had been engineered on paper now determined whether a man lived or died. The enemy pilot pursuing this wounded aircraft experienced something deeply unsettling. Each burst of fire should have ended the encounter. Each hit should have been decisive. And yet the Thunderbolt remained, scarred but defiant, carving its path through the sky as if daring the laws of war to contradict it. Ammunition was expended. Fuel was consumed. Time stretched longer than expected. The fight no longer followed familiar rhythms. It became something else, entirely a confrontation with inevitability. As the distance closed, the enemy pilot drew near enough to see the damage clearly. He could see the torn metal, the leaking fluids, the evidence of destruction that should have been fatal. And still the aircraft flew. In that instant, something shifted. The conflict was no longer about skill or courage. It was about realization. The realization that this machine was not designed to win gracefully or to fail quickly. It was designed to endure longer than its opponent could sustain the effort to destroy it. That realization carried weight far beyond the cockpit. It echoed through every future engagement, every tactical decision, every moment of hesitation that followed. The Thunderbolt had revealed a truth that could not be unlearned. The war in the air had changed. No longer was victory determined solely by maneuver or marksmanship. It was determined by systems that could absorb damage, replace losses, and continue forward without pause. The human element remained vital, but it was now embedded within something larger, something more relentless. When the Thunderbolt finally turned away from that engagement and began the long journey back toward friendly territory, it carried with it more than a wounded pilot and a battered airframe. It carried proof. Proof that American engineering, when aligned with strategic necessity, could rewrite the boundaries of possibility. The aircraft did not glide home untouched. It limped, scarred and bleeding, a visible testament to the violence it had endured. Yet it arrived. And arrival, in that context, was everything. On the ground, mechanics would later examine the damage with disbelief. Holes counted in the hundreds. Systems that should have failed still functioning. Structures that should have collapsed holding together long enough to save a life. Each scar told a story, not of luck, but of intention. The Thunderbolt had been built for this. It had been prepared for the worst and had delivered exactly what it promised: survival under conditions designed to destroy. Word of such encounters spread quickly, not through official reports alone, but through conversations, glances, and shared understanding among those who flew and fought. Confidence grew on one side of the conflict, while doubt quietly took root on the other. Every Thunderbolt that returned damaged but intact reinforced the same message. This was not a machine you could easily remove from the sky. This was not an opponent that followed familiar rules. This was a manifestation of industrial power translated directly into combat endurance. As the war pressed on, this endurance became increasingly decisive. Ground targets fell under sustained assault. Supply lines were severed. Enemy movement became constrained not just by firepower, but by the constant presence of aircraft that refused to be deterred. The Thunderbolt did not need to dominate headlines to dominate outcomes. Its influence was measured in disrupted logistics, broken morale, and the slow erosion of resistance. Beyond Europe, similar realizations unfolded in other theaters. Allied pilots flying the Thunderbolt in diverse conditions discovered that its strength was not situational. It endured across climates, missions, and levels of intensity. Whether escorting bombers, hunting ground targets, or surviving catastrophic damage, the aircraft delivered consistency in a war defined by uncertainty. This consistency was its greatest weapon. By the time the conflict approached its later stages, the Thunderbolt had already secured its place in history, not through spectacle, but through repetition. It survived. It returned. It flew again. Each cycle reinforced the same conclusion. American power in this war was not built on singular moments of brilliance, but on systems designed to function under stress, absorb loss, and continue forward without hesitation. And in that truth lay the ultimate impact of the Thunderbolt. It was not simply a fighter aircraft. It was a demonstration. A demonstration that modern war favored those who could build for endurance, plan for damage, and sustain effort longer than their enemies could endure uncertainty. The Thunderbolt did not just change the skies. It changed how victory itself was understood. As the Thunderbolt's legend hardened into something undeniable, its role in the war expanded with a kind of brutal inevitability. Once pilots and commanders understood that this aircraft could absorb punishment and still return, a new door opened, and it led straight down toward the ground. The sky had been its proving ground, but the battlefield below would become the place where its true weight could be felt, not as an idea, not as a rumor, but as a physical force descending from above. The Thunderbolt was not merely a shield for bomber formations. It became a hammer, and when it fell upon enemy infrastructure, the results were immediate and unrelenting. There was a particular kind of power in an aircraft that could dive fast, strike hard, and climb away while the ground still shook beneath it. The Thunderbolt's size, its stability, and the raw momentum created by its weight gave it an advantage that was not graceful but decisive. In steep dives, it accelerated like a falling monument, and when it leveled out, it carried the certainty of impact with it. Those 8.50 caliber machine guns were not simply weapons. They were a statement of volume, of excess, of the American approach to war distilled into sound and steel. When they fired together, they did not just hit targets. They erased them. They shredded trucks and rail cars, split fuel tanks, tore through thin armor, and cut into the arteries of movement that kept armies alive. And when machine guns were not enough, the Thunderbolt arrived carrying bombs and rockets, turning a fighter into a moving arsenal, a platform capable of striking bridges, depots, roads, and fortifications with a kind of relentless practicality. The enemy learned quickly that the Thunderbolt was not a weapon you could simply wait out. It did not appear once in a while as a special threat. It became a recurring presence, and recurrence is what breaks morale. A single attack can be endured. Repeated attacks transform the environment itself into fear. Rail lines became vulnerable. Convoys moved under constant threat. Ground troops learned to recognize the distant sound of that engine note as the beginning of something they could not easily stop. Anti-aircraft guns fired, shells burst, smoke rose, and often the aircraft still came through. Even when the Thunderbolt was hit, it frequently returned again, repaired, patched, and ready, proving that damage was not the end of the story. It was only a chapter. In this way, the Thunderbolt became more than a machine. It became a pattern. A rhythm of pressure applied to the battlefield day after day, mission after mission, until the enemy's ability to respond began to collapse under the weight of unpredictability. Because what made the Thunderbolt terrifying was not just its power, but its reliability. It could be depended upon. It could be scheduled. It could be directed. It could be counted on to arrive and execute the mission with ruthless consistency. That consistency is what turns force into dominance. And dominance, sustained long enough, turns into inevitability. Across Allied airfields, crews worked with a methodical urgency that reflected the larger American system behind the war. Damaged aircraft returned, and the response was not despair or disbelief, but routine competence. Panels were replaced. Holes were patched. Systems were tested and repaired. Engines were serviced. Weapons were recalibrated. The Thunderbolt did not become legendary because it avoided damage. It became legendary because the entire system surrounding it treated damage as expected, manageable, and temporary. This was American strength expressed not through bragging, but through repetition. Through an industrial culture that did not collapse under stress, but accelerated under it. And it was here that the enemy's deeper realization took shape. They were not simply facing a nation with brave pilots. They were facing a civilization that had turned production into strategy. A nation capable of building aircraft in massive numbers, training men to fly them, maintaining them in harsh conditions, shipping parts and fuel across oceans, and sustaining operational tempo long enough to exhaust opposing systems. This was not merely technological superiority. It was organizational superiority. The Thunderbolt was simply the face of it, the steel silhouette that appeared overhead as proof that the American machine was still turning. This truth became even more visible when Allied forces advanced across Europe and the demands of close air support increased. The battlefield was fluid, chaotic, and unforgiving, requiring aircraft that could strike quickly and survive heavy ground fire. In these conditions, the Thunderbolt thrived. Its armor and structure gave it the ability to press attacks that might have been suicidal in lighter aircraft. Its firepower allowed it to deliver results with brutal efficiency. And when it took hits, it often came back, reinforcing the same lesson to both friend and foe. This machine did not quit, and the system behind it did not either. Among those who carried this legacy into combat were pilots far from the American heartland, men whose languages and flags differed, but whose missions were bound to the same Allied effort. In Italy, Brazilian pilots flew the P-47 in relentless operations that demanded courage and precision. They learned quickly what American pilots had already discovered. The Thunderbolt was a partner in survival, a machine that offered a rare second chance in an environment that normally offered none. Stories emerged that sounded unbelievable until one understood what the Thunderbolt was designed to do. An aircraft returning with structural damage that should have ended it. A pilot surviving against odds that would have been fatal in another machine. The Thunderbolt made these stories possible not through magic, but through engineering decisions rooted in the same philosophy of endurance. This shared experience created something profound. The Thunderbolt became a unifying symbol of Allied capability, a common tool that delivered consistent results across different units, nations, and theaters. It demonstrated that American industry was not producing weapons for itself alone, but feeding a coalition with machines that could carry the war forward. The aircraft became part of a larger narrative in which American industrial strength did not merely defend national interests, but shaped the outcome of a global conflict through tangible, repeatable capability. As the war moved toward its final stages, the Thunderbolt's influence could be felt not in isolated victories, but in the slow erosion of the enemy's ability to function. When supply lines are disrupted repeatedly, armies starve. When railways are shattered, reinforcements arrive late. When convoys are destroyed, fuel runs out. When troops fear the sky, movement becomes cautious and slow. The Thunderbolt contributed to this erosion not by being the only weapon, but by being a consistent one. And consistency, when applied at scale, becomes decisive. What remained most striking, even as the war's end approached, was how the Thunderbolt's core identity never changed. It remained what it had always been, a machine built to endure, built to hit hard, built to return. It did not need to be celebrated loudly to be effective. It simply needed to keep appearing, mission after mission, as a reminder that the American system behind it was still functioning, still producing, still advancing. For the enemy, this was the most exhausting truth of all, that there was no single decisive blow that could make it stop. The Thunderbolt did not represent a moment. It represented momentum. And momentum, once it reaches a certain scale, becomes legacy. Because even after the war ended, the philosophy that created the Thunderbolt did not vanish with the surrender documents or the closing ceremonies. It remained embedded in American thinking, waiting to reappear in another era, another conflict, another machine. The name itself would return decades later, not as nostalgia, but as continuation, attached to an aircraft built with the same brutal logic. Survive, strike, bring the pilot home. The Thunderbolt had proven that a nation's power is not only in what it can build once, but in what it can build repeatedly, maintain relentlessly, and deploy with unwavering purpose. In the end, what the Thunderbolt revealed to the world was not merely the strength of a single aircraft, but the power of a way of thinking. Long after the smoke cleared and the skies grew quiet, the lesson it carried remained unmistakable. Modern war had crossed a threshold where courage alone was no longer enough, where brilliance without support faded quickly, and where survival itself became a strategic advantage. The Thunderbolt stood at that threshold as proof that when a nation commits fully to technology, planning, and industrial scale, it does not simply compete in war, it reshapes the conditions under which war is fought. The aircraft never needed myth to elevate it. Its story was written in patched metal, in engines that continued to turn when logic said they should not, in pilots who stepped out alive from machines that looked like wreckage. Each return to base was a quiet declaration that American strength was not fragile, not temporary, and not dependent on perfect circumstances. It was resilient by design. It assumed adversity and prepared for it. And in doing so, it removed uncertainty from its own side while imposing it relentlessly on the enemy. For those who faced it from the ground or the air, the Thunderbolt became something deeply unsettling. It represented a future where resistance did not lead to relief, only repetition, where damage did not end the fight, only delayed it, where the sky itself seemed controlled by a system that could replace losses, repair wounds, and return with undiminished force. This was not intimidation born of fear alone. It was intimidation born of realization, the realization that the balance had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. The true victory of the Thunderbolt was not measured solely in aircraft destroyed or targets eliminated, but in the slow collapse of confidence it induced. When enemy pilots hesitated, when ground troops moved cautiously, when supply lines faltered under constant threat, the Thunderbolt's impact became strategic rather than tactical. It did not seek dramatic finales. It applied pressure until resistance thinned, choices narrowed, and outcomes became inevitable. This was the American approach to total war made visible, audible, and unavoidable. And when the war finally ended, the Thunderbolt did not fade into irrelevance. Its philosophy endured, carried forward into new generations of machines built on the same principle, that survival is power, that endurance wins conflicts, and that bringing the pilot home is not a luxury but a requirement. The name Thunderbolt would rise again decades later, attached to a new aircraft shaped by the same uncompromising logic, proving that this was never about a single moment in history. It was about continuity. What the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt ultimately left behind was a message etched into the history of warfare. When a nation aligns its technology, its strategy, and its industrial will, it creates more than weapons. It creates inevitability. The Thunderbolt did not conquer the sky through elegance or spectacle. It conquered it through persistence, resilience, and the quiet confidence of a system that knew it could not be outlasted. And that is why, even today, its legacy endures. not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of what happens when power is built deliberately, applied relentlessly, and sustained without hesitation. The thunderbolt did not just fly through history. It carved a path that others would follow, proving once and for all that in modern war, the greatest force is not speed or beauty, but the unbreakable union of technology, industry, and purpose.